Vanakkam. Welcome to this course on classics in neuroscience. In this series of videos, we will be looking at functional organization of neurons and dendrites. In this video, we will be discussing how Ramonika Hall introduced this concept of dynamic polarization of neuron. What do we mean by this? Dynamic polarization. Polarization is something to do with directionality. We will discuss that in good detail in this video. So, the neuron doctrine posited that each nerve cell or neuron is an individual and they interact with each other through contact. This is the neuron doctrine. In addition to his great contribution through the neuron doctrine, Santiago Ramon y Cajal also contributed by suggesting two other things. The first concept is the law of dynamic polarization. This essentially suggested that there was a directionality associated with information flow within a neuron. That is, information was first received in the dendrites, then through a not so simple process is being integrated in the cell body, which may or may not generate an action potential in the axon hillock, which then if it generates an action potential, it then travels through the axon. So, there is an flow of activity through the neurons. So, there is a dendrites are receiving information and then the information from various dendrites is getting summed, not simply added, it can be more than that. So, the nature of information processing within the neuron itself is a complicated topic, and then if it produces an action potential, if it generates an action potential at the axon hillock, then it travels through the axon to the various collaterals of the axon to the axon terminals. This principle came to be called as the law of dynamic polarization. So, more like an empirical law, it is not a law in the Newton's law sense of the word law, still it is a law. So, essentially what this means from a functional viewpoint is that the neuron is an integrative entity. Although it is an individual, it still performs the function of integration. It receives inputs from various cells and then it distributes inputs to various target cells. So, it performs some form of processing, information processing and integration of information. The second concept builds on the first concept. Santiago Ramon y Cajal was an extraordinarily imaginative person. Remember, we have said this previously, imagination is more powerful than knowledge. So, Santiago Ramon y Cajal used his powers of imagination to interpret how information flows through neurons, through various neurons within a network. So, to develop what can be functional relations between regions within a network. So, between stem cells, he was interested in interpreting the functional relations in the direction of flow of information. So, these two concepts essentially deduce information flow within the cell and between cells, because if information flows from the dendrites, if it produces an action potential in the axon hillock and goes through the axon and activates dendrites of other neurons, so information flows unidirectionally via the axon to the dendrite of the second neuron. So, that is the direction in which communication is happening. Of course, it is entirely possible that the second neuron also sends its axon and communicates with the first neuron. There are these kind of recursive loops, many of those within the central nervous system, but here I am considering a continuous network, continuous in the sense not in the sense in which Golgi represented, but rather continuous in the sense there were contacts and that were communicating with each other, neurons were communicating with each other. So, information was integrated from different sources and distributed to more than one source. If the axon terminal, the collaterals are many, the input will go to all of them. Remember, if the axon, if one part of the axon is conducting action potential, all of them will eventually conduct. All the axonal terminals or all the axon collaterals will produce action potential. This is what we understand from our description of action potential. So, he also then used this principle to describe information flow within the olfactory bulb, within retina, for example. Many of these principles and concepts Santiago Ramon y Cajal summarized or presented in his work on histology of the nervous system. It's called as the histology textbook. So, David Hubel mentioned that this is perhaps the most important work ever in the field of neurobiology. Yes. And Charles Sherrington, in his textbook on the integrative action of the nervous system, mentions how the discussion of the cellular distinction happens primarily in the nervous system much more than in the other systems. Thus, the neuron doctrine essentially is the fundamental organizing principle for neuroscience and neurobiology. Essentially provides the conceptual basis for what is now modern neuroscience. This is the conceptual basis of modern neuroscience. Like you have atoms for physics, chemical bonds in chemistry, cells in cell biology, genes in genetics, for example. You have the concept of the neuron in the field of neuroscience and neurobiology. This principle, this concept and the idea that information flows in specific direction essentially helps us form good hypothesis that you can then test. So, essentially you can simplify postulates, help understand normal brain function and abnormal or non-normal, essentially diseases of the neurological system. With this, we come to the end of this video. In this video, we discussed about dynamic polarization of the neuron, an idea that was proposed by Santiago Ramon y Cajal, where he suggested that there was a directionality involved for flow of activity and flow of information within the neuron, but also between neurons. By the way, there are exceptions to this rule. There are cases where conduction can happen antidromically in a direction opposite from the axon to the cell body. There are some specific cases, and there are cases where information that is produced by one axon collateral is received by a neuron that again communicates with the previous neuron. These kind of recursive loops are present throughout the central nervous system. So, there are always exceptions. As I mentioned previously, exception is the rule in biology, but this is still an interesting and very useful framework for us to formulate hypotheses and test. With this, we come to the end of this video. Thank you for your attention.